Welcome everyone to mocha.org for virtual mocha. My name is Brian Barsana. I am assistant curator of programs and manager of publications here at the museum. And I'm so pleased that you guys have joined us and that our panelists have joined us to this panel, which is going to discuss access inclusion to Los Angeles public parks and civic spaces. I wanted to first of all thank our panelists and thank Brian Dang, our programs coordinator, for coordinating, and also to thank the Sam Francis Foundation California for their support of our programs. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to this panel because I want to set this up as this is going to be a series of panels discussing outdoor art and outdoor life here in Los Angeles. As you may or may not know, MoCA continues to be closed to the public. We have been closed since March, and we wanted to find ways that our constituents, our public, our city can continue to see art here, and that we could be able to talk about art that people can still see rather than stuff that's downstairs in the galleries or in our storage. So for the next few months, we're going to try and focus on outdoor artworks that you can visit here at the museum or around the city. We're going to have a lot of discussions about the artworks themselves, the spaces they're in, how they contribute to civic life, how civic life has changed here vis-a-vis public space over the course of the last few months. This is the first in that series that'll culminate probably in the spring sometime with a much larger project behind me. With that having been said, you should also check out in November, we're going to have a series of videos, our usual artist on artist series, where artists comment on the work of other artists. Will move outdoors and we'll be commenting on public artworks. So with that, the format for this panel today, we have 4 presenters, which will each be giving a short presentation on some of the work they're doing in terms of public space here in Los Angeles. There will be a short moderated discussion after each one of them, after all of them together give their presentation, and we'll save some time at the end for Q&A. So please feel free to put your questions in the question and answer box, and we'll try to get to some of them at the end. I'm just going to read some abbreviated bios to introduce our panelists, and then we will start our presentations. So we'll start with Julia Meltzer. Julia Meltzer is a filmmaker and the founding director of Clock Shop. Clock Shop believes in the power of contemporary art to connect people to the land on which they live. Through commissions of new artworks and programs, Clock Shop works collaboratively to catalyze larger institutions. Jessica Henson is a landscape architect at Olin, where she is currently the project manager for the 2020 Los Angeles County LA River Master Plan. At Olin, she has developed numerous planning and design projects that seek to create socially and environmentally resilient infrastructure, including the LA River Index and the Rio Hondo Confluence Area Project. Rosten Wu is a designer, writer, and educator living in Los Angeles. He produces civic scale artworks and works as a collaborator and consultant to a variety of grassroots and nonprofit organizations. And finally, Marcos Trinidad has been center director at the Audubon Center at Debs Park for 5 years, and during that time has nurtured a growing community of volunteers and community partnerships, implemented a facility and grounds improvement plan, and partnered with the National Park Service to establish a vibrant native plant nursery. With those introductions, I want to welcome everyone once again, and we are going to move to Julia.
Hi, thanks, Brian. Thanks for that introduction and for inviting me to present. It's great to be here with Jessica, Marcos, and Rosten, all people who I know and have worked with. Appreciate being here with you all. I'm going to share my screen, and then maybe you can tell me how it's going to work. So I just briefly, I founded Clock Shop 16 years ago with the idea to bring more art to public space in Los Angeles. And I grew up here and spent time going to LACMA, Barnesdale, and other spaces that were actually, public space, publicly funded art spaces. And that influenced who I became. And I thought that there was a space to bring art to other kind of non-designated art spaces. And that was Clock Shop's mission and remains that. About 6 years ago, we initiated a project with California State Parks to work on the bow tie, which is along the LA River. Our space is located in Elysian Valley, and we're along the LA River. And I've seen over the almost 20 years that we've been here, a lot of change happening in our neighborhood related to LA River revitalization. So I'm gonna switch. Did that work to switch? Is everyone, okay, cool. So I'm gonna start here with this archival image of, it's actually an aerial image of Elysian Valley and the river, pre-channelization from 1934. This is from the archive of the Bureau of Public Works. And what I want to look at here is the river and the floodplain, and just how there's no separation between the river and the city, the built environment. And then on the other side, you see Elysian Park. I don't know that it was called Elysian Park then, but you know, there really was this kind of fluid connection between the river and nature. And you know, this was several years before channelization, but really clearly, like, the floodplain is important to this area. And you can also see a little bit of Taylor Yard there, which is where the bow tie is and where all of this public space, future green space, will be happening. So then flash forward to where we are now. This is kind of marks public open space along the LA River. So you could see LA State Historic Park, Albion Park, Ed Reyes Greenway, Elysian Park. This is like, you know, the green spots along the river that we have channelized and built up around, and really created this honestly, this kind of mess of a situation where freeways overcross the channel, and it's almost as if we have separated the natural world from our environment, and we're trying to get back to that. So this is, I want to point this out because these are public spaces that, you know, are funded by taxpayer money, and that California State Parks and other agencies have owned for quite some time. And we're just seeing, you know, them actually come to the point where they might again be green spaces. And here, this is an image of Taylor Yards, I think probably around 1990, right around when it was decommissioned. And this is where the G2 is. Maybe I'm going to say some things that maybe some people know about and other people don't, but the G2 is the property that the city recently purchased, which abuts the bow tie. And then there's the rail line, and then there's where Sotomayor campus is, and the river channel, which is part of the section of river that was slated for revitalization money. And here, this is the bow tie today. So this piece of land is just across the river and a little bit south of us. You can see the river, and this is what the bow tie looks like now. This was taken a couple years ago, and you can see the big box buildings there. And basically, you know, this land could have been that, were it not for community organizing that happened to get government agencies to purchase this piece of land and have it be in the public. You know, California State Parks, just a little background, has owned this piece of land since 2003. So it's been close to 20 years that this land has been in public hands, but has not been developed as a park. And I think it goes without saying that, you know, we're in a neighborhood that is very rapidly gentrifying, and that is very park poor. And, you know, these spaces are very much needed by the neighborhoods that are around it. But also bringing green space, of course, brings a whole other host of issues and problems, which is what we're here to talk about today. So, and it was in a way, this situation of LA River revitalization bringing to bear gentrification and a lot of change in our neighborhood that we saw starting really very, very clearly in around the crash and afterwards, 2008, and then more clearly around when the Army Corps recognized that they approved the plan for revitalization, but didn't necessarily offer dollars. But that spun off a whole other set of real estate speculation. And so prices for houses and land around the LA River skyrocketed. And that's been the situation that we've been in for the past, I'd say, decade. And I also want to point out here, before I talk about this piece, that you could see that white building there in the background. That's the Nelson Miller building, which I'll bring up later on. And this piece, The Unfinished by Michael Parker, was something that we commissioned in 2014, along with a program that we did called Frogtown Futuro. And Frogtown Futuro was looking at our neighborhood, Elysian Valley or Frogtown, and how LA River revitalization was affecting it. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to bring a public art project as part of it. And Michael Parker had a project, this unfinished obelisk, which is basically a replica of the unfinished obelisk that is in Egypt and along the Nile River, and he wanted to reconstruct it. And we brought that project to California State Parks, and they said, great, let's do it. I was really surprised by that, but we reconstructed this 35-foot obelisk on California State Park land, and that was the first project that set off this partnership. So I'm going to flip through a number of images of projects that we've done over the last 6 years. Building a Simulacrum of Power performance by 2014. This is a project by Rosten Wu, maybe he'll talk about this. 2015, Kiosk, the Bowtie Parcel, which really looked at who gets to sleep outdoors, camping. Where is camping designated and where is it not allowed? Where are people who are unhoused not allowed to be? And it's really kind of an intro to the bow tie and how you might see this piece of land. That piece is still there. Rosten also did this piece, Water Underfoot, or Agua Bajo Pie, which looks at water in the LA River and basically where is it going and how are we using water. We did a number of performances, Aisha Paget, 2015, Ever Each More, which was a performance that ran the length of the bow tie. 2017, Julia Half Kendall, Denim Chain on Trees. And all of this work over the past 6 years really has been with the impetus and the mission to bring people to the bow tie, to the river, to have an emotional experience and to have an attachment to the piece of land that they're on and to the relationship to the river, and basically encourage them to become stewards of this piece of land and feel something about it and care for it and want to protect it. In the background of this image, you can see the building this is another development that's happened recently in Frogtown, which actually is a, high-end condo units with, I think, only 1 or 2 affordable units in there, which only after a lot of pressure from community organizations were they made was the community in Frogtown made aware that these units were available. So again, the tension between what developers want and expect and how they roll into these neighborhoods, and really without not a lot of regard for who's been there before and who's going to get to stay. This is a project by Beatriz Cortez, Solking. We did this in partnership with the Hammer Museum, and then there was a piece that was at the Hammer and then a piece that was at the bow tie, her sculpture there. And then at that point, I reached out to Socrates Sculpture Park in New York, which has a very similar history to the bow tie, but only they're about 25 years ahead. And we established an exchange, and Beatrice's piece went to New York. And we brought this piece into the ground here. And then most recently last year, Hatch by Jesse Herod, a piece that had also been at Socrates, we brought here. So in addition to these commissions, we also had a very kind of rich and you know, amazing public program. This is a photo from 2015. Carolina Casedo worked with students from Sotomayor to bring them to the river and talk about the relationship between the land and the river. And also we did this program called Bowtie Field Day, which grew out of a camping thing, where we worked with a National Park Service, California State Parks, and any community organization, Friends of the Los Angeles River, US Forest Service, to bring people who had not had the experience of camping or being along the river. And then also this campfire was something that we built with students, Woodbury students, architecture students did that. Reading by Moonrise, a program that we do readings on the night of the full moon. And here's another kind of native plant bird watching event with Kaya, who's working with National Park Service and California State Parks. I'm showing all of these things basically to kind of give a kind of complete picture of everything that we've been doing over the last 6 years to cultivate a community and momentum around the Bowtie and what it will become. So most recently, our youth program, Bowtie Storytellers, was a program that we invited 7 youth who had an honorarium to become certified interpreters. And that led into the Bowtie Youth Council, which is where we are today. And really thinking about the future of this piece of land as it moves into conceptual design and becoming the next state park. Who's speaking for what this park will become? And you know, my feeling, this piece of land has been owned by California State Parks for close to 20 years. And it is, honestly, I feel like a travesty that that land is within a government agency for so long, and it takes so long to build that green space. And so, you know, all of us in Clock Shop really reflect upon who is going to be the steward of this piece of land. Who's it for? It's for these young people, these 10 young people who will be working with us over the next year to basically put forth their vision of the park that is to come. And I just want to step back and kind of look at the history and how long this process has been going on. Certainly, we did not begin this at Clock Shop. We are stepping into a continuum of organizing here that's been going on at Taylor Yard and at Rio de Los Angeles and all the state lands and public lands. So this image you see is Anahuac soccer youth. Probably these kids here are now maybe in their 30s or maybe their 40s. I don't know. Maybe they're, you know, somewhere in there, and they have Rio de Los Angeles, but we still need more space. This is just another archival image from the organizing that happened to make this park a reality. And I want to end this presentation by kind of giving people an overview, because I think it's not really fully understood. It's confusing even sometimes to me. This is a map that kind of lays out the public land. So you see there's the Bowtie, which is that green piece of land, and then that comes up against the G2, a portion of which is owned by MRCA, and then the city owns the G2, and then they co-manage Rio. And then I also want to point out the Nelson Miller building here. So this building is now owned, oops, didn't mean to do that. This building is now owned by a New York developer, and they are in the process of hoping to entitle 419 condo units that would be right at the edge, the opening of this state land. So you can see there, this little red triangle there, and then that is the entrance to this 100-acre park project. So, you know, is this what we want at the opening of our state park? I don't know. For me personally, I say no. I say no. So we have been working over the past 4 years with a coalition of organizations, and our work, both around art, but also around organizing, has taken up working with NRDC, the National Resource Defense Council, FOLAR, LA River State Park Partners, Mujeres de la Tierra, a number of organizations saying, we want to raise questions about this development, and we do not want it there. We do not want this park to be for upscale condo units. And this is the coalition that we have worked together to build. And I just want to end here on the river. And, you know, this state land is coming, this publicly owned land is coming up right against the river. And what we're all working towards is to get back to the river and maintain a connection, and a connection that's for the public. Thanks.
Thank you, Julia. That's amazing work that you guys are doing, both on the art side and on the advocating side. I think we're gonna hear from Jessica now, who's gonna tell us, I think, a lot more about the LA River. Go ahead.
Awesome. Well, I just want to echo Julia in saying thank you. This is, I think, a really great panel to join today. And I always like hearing Julia talk, because those on the ground experiences of our public spaces and art is what it's all about. And so some of the planning that I get to do is hopefully in support of those spaces. And so it's wonderful to start out with that context. So hi, everyone. I am going to be talking a little bit more about the LA River and a few different projects working with different government entities on currently regarding the river itself. And I'm sure a lot of you on this call today are quite familiar with the Los Angeles River, but for anybody that isn't, maybe just a quick little geography. So downtown Los Angeles being kind of in the middle here, the LA River is 51 miles long. The main stem flows from the West San Fernando Valley around Canoga Park, the neighborhood in the city of LA, flows on the north side of the Santa Monica Mountains, turns south around Griffith Park through Glendale, and then flows down to the Pacific Ocean, where it exits into at Long Beach. And the interesting thing about the LA River, I mean, it's very iconic in the sense that it's been featured in movies throughout the decades. Of course, many of you on this call are probably familiar with the channelization, that most of it is currently concrete. But what's really interesting when you start digging into the river, there's 2,300 acres of open space between in the fence line of the river, in the right of way of the river. So there's a lot of space when we start thinking and breaking down the needs for open space and public space and habitat within Los Angeles County. And there are about 1 million people that live within a mile of the river, so very close to it. And you start to imagine how much this river means already to the communities along its banks, and then the potential for the river and the open spaces and the habitat and ecosystems along it to make such a difference. About a quarter of the state of California population lives within a 1-hour drive of the river. So this is such a significant resource and piece of our communities. We started looking at the LA River in detail many years ago, and started with this project that was funded by a couple of the state conservancies for the LA River Index. And what this work was an effort really to bring together a lot of different data sources that were for different parts of the river into cohesive pieces of information that covered all 51 miles. And we did this in partnership, it was us at Olin with Gary Partners and with Geosyntec. And really in looking at this, what started as an effort to understand the hydraulics and the hydrology of the river and the overall watershed began to grow and expand to understand park space, to talk about ecology, to talk about health and public health, and to think about programming, transportation, and all those other elements that are really critical to the equity across the board for people around the river. Takes you back, of course, millennia when you start thinking about the LA River and the geomorphology. But really also very interestingly, before the river heavy channelization of the 1930s, in 1930, the Olmsted Bartholomew Plan, which was a regional parks plan for Los Angeles and Los Angeles County, already sort of predicted the lack of open space that we feel today, and the fact that the absence of parks would make it harder and harder, the living conditions less and less attractive, and that the growth of the region would begin to strangle itself. And so in that plan, they actually proposed 71,000 acres of parkland, very much of it along things like our drainage ways, streams, and rivers. Unfortunately, that plan was never realized for a whole host of different reasons. Of course, the Great Depression, World War II, and then also a series of very significant floods in the 1930s. And unfortunately, rather than building a lot of these excellent open spaces and greenways, the river was fully channelized and concretized into what we know of the LA River today. As you are also probably familiar, 17 different cities are adjacent to the river, and many City of LA neighborhoods, unincorporated LA County. It's a very multi-jurisdictional river. Parts of it are operated and maintained by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, other parts by the Los Angeles County Flood Control District. So working in the context of the LA River requires a lot of cross-jurisdictional coordination and collaboration, and also with state conservancies and various nonprofits and other organizations. But perhaps what's so interesting when you look at the LA River, which for so many has been seen as somewhat of a like the backyard or not the ideal place to live in Los Angeles County, compared to saying like living along the beach or something. When you look at where the LA River flows, it actually flows through some of the most environmentally burdened communities of Los Angeles County. And so this is the Cal EnviroStream. Many of you might be familiar with this study, but it compares communities across the entire state of California on the basis of about 21 different factors, looking at socioeconomic factors, but also environmental conditions. And so the red are areas that are in the worst 10 percentile of the entire state in terms of environmental and socioeconomic burdens. And so you can see that the Los Angeles River flows through, especially the south part of the Los Angeles River flows through some of those neighborhoods with the most environmental burden. And so thinking about these 2,300 acres of open space along the right-of-way, one of the big questions is how can the Los Angeles River help to move the needle for some of those communities? The challenge, of course, with that is that the 51 miles of the Los Angeles River are unique. Each kind of stretch is hydraulically unique, just in how water moves through different parts of the channel. But they're also very unique communities and identities along all 51 miles. And so something we've said a lot for the last 5 or 6 years is there's not a single design solution that works for all 51 miles of the river, that works for every neighborhood adjacent. And so thinking about what that is and how that could be thought about in a plan that's a framework is something I'll talk about in a minute that we've been working on with Los Angeles County. The other thing that we've started doing more and more of, especially with the Los Angeles River Master Plan that we're working on with the county, is thinking about how different community partnerships can form. So, you know, youth summits or working in the Sela region with the Arts Festival, thinking about, there's an exhibit in the lower right-hand corner here with Las Fotos and a Native community discussion in the upper right. So through this work that we've been trying to do over the last 2.5 years, expanding that conversation and speaking to different communities, recognizing that there are unique voices and unique identities along the 51 miles of the river. And how do you plan for the river in an environment to bring different voices to the table? And I will say, you know, I think this is an ever-evolving conversation. There's always more room to make the table bigger, and there's always the hope to bring more and more people into that conversation as it goes forward. And the work that we're doing right now with LA County, the master plan is based on this community process, and 9 goals that are co-equal have come to the forefront of that. They range from ones you might expect, like flood risk, The LA River does help to manage flood waters when it rains very heavily, but also some that you might not expect in a public works infrastructure planning document, such as thinking about housing affordability, concerns about displacement, helping with people experiencing homelessness, and how do we start to have that conversation in a productive way, talking about arts and culture and community development, education. The ones that you might have expected, ecosystems, parks, water supply, and water quality, of course, are critical to the river and the different areas along it. But the challenge is really, how do you think about goals for the river, where there's 9 different priorities here, and how do you bring data, how do you bring community engagement together across all of these and start to make decisions and prioritize for the river? And one thing that became increasingly clear is that we were going to need some sort of database that could bring all of this different information together. And so one of the tools of the LA River Master Plan is this LA River Ruler System. It's a linearized version of the 51 miles of the river. And what this allows us to do is take something like park need. Here is the LA County park needs, red, showing areas that have very high park need. And we can look along the river and see very quickly with this river ruler system where those areas of high need are. And then because we are putting all of the information resources, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, into these systems, we can quickly compare different data sources. So here you can see the park need and the Cal Enviro screen, that pollution data we were looking at earlier, cross-referenced, and we can start to call out areas along the river that have very high needs in various areas. And we've done this for a lot of data sets. We've looked at things like health statistics. So this is just one example of, say, asthma, and where we're seeing very high asthma rates in children. We also recently have been looking, of course, at COVID, and not surprisingly, but very unfortunately, communities with high pollution rates, high asthma rates, are also seeing very high COVID rates. And this looks a lot like the park need map and a lot like the Cal Enviro screen map, unfortunately. And so you're seeing communities that are very hard hit right now in the COVID pandemic as well. So all of these things are coming together in a series of hundreds of data sets that then can be used for decision makers, for policymakers, to be able to make educated decisions, because all the communities along the 51 miles aren't the same. And so this allows to know, where are there really high ecosystem needs? Where are there really high flood needs or worries? From those data sets related to each of the goals, what we've created is a needs map that can be utilized for decision making. And the other great thing about this methodology is, since it's based on those underlying data sets, as better data becomes available, the county can update that. And so over the next 2.5 decades, which is the lifespan of the LA River Master Plan project, this can be an evolving methodology, so that as new information, climate change is something, for example, that as better data becomes available literally on the day-to-day, can be embedded into that. So understanding those needs, the next step is really thinking about where is there opportunity spaces along the river to help meet some of those needs in terms of physical park space, or other water quality projects, etc. And so what the LA River Master Plan puts forth is a series of really small projects from the access scale up to really large projects, regional park scale, and where those could be in an equitable cadence along the LA River, along the 51 miles. It doesn't design what those spaces specifically are. It gives the needs and the opportunity for them. But the goal, of course, being to create a 51-mile connected public open space along the river, with thousands of acres of habitat areas, of park space, of water quality projects and improvements. Just a couple last things here as I start to wrap up. The master plan also puts forth a series of design guidelines that help make sure that there's amenities and cadence. Right now, it's hard to be along the river in terms of public space, because there's not a restroom, or there's not some of those simple basic things that you might need. And so putting forth that suite to help the river be a very usable open space. And integrating public art through all of those elements is something that's very critical to the proposals of the plan. But just starting to think about how some of those spaces might come together. The master plan does have diagrammatic ideas for, say, like river pavilions that could provide some of those basic amenities. We're also working on some larger projects along the river right now. This is the area at the Rio Hondo confluence that Brian mentioned in the introductions. But just to give an example, I thought that this would be a useful way to end the presentation here is, this is what the Rio Hondo confluence looks like today. And if you look at the needs mapping for this area, there's an incredibly high park need. There are high water quality needs, arts, culture, education needs in this area. And today, right now, the average number of acres of park per 1,000 people in this area is about 1.4. Just to give you a feel for that, the overall average in LA County is 3.3, and the overall county goal is to have 4 acres per 1,000 people. So this is like massively underparked. So the proposal that we're working with here in the lower river at the Rio Hondo confluence creates about 120 acres of park space. It considers changes for the channel itself, which include terracing, which include a blue park, which improves sediment flow and other things in the low flow channel of the center of the LA River. It includes wetlands adjacent to the channel for stormwater runoff and water quality. And it also includes bridge parks that stretch over the river, connecting communities that are currently isolated from one another, while creating that very much needed park space here in this region. So bringing this sort of back into the health story from earlier, thinking about how people might use these spaces in terms of health and wellness, getting outside. We've created a series of loops. There's an art loop, a health and wellness loop, an ecosystems loop, et cetera, for how people might use some of these spaces in the future. And then starting to imagine what some of them might look like with native habitat is critical here, increasing our biodiversity of plant species, creating some of those critical links for migrating birds and habitat, but also creating spaces for recreation, for education, for learning. And then in this last image here, we're imagining what some of these spaces that are particularly for water quality improvements would look like, and some of the habitat areas that would be created along the river. So all in all, the goals that we're working toward here with the county and with some other entities like the RMC are to really massively increase park space along the river, utilizing the 2,300 acres in that right of way to really move the needle for some of these communities that are feeling some of the biggest burdens. Doing so in a equitable way where we're trying to focus on goals across the board so that we're not just causing green gentrification and displacement, but in a way that can be really truly meaningful for the residents that live there presently. Thanks, Brian.
Awesome. Thank you. I love seeing all that data. It makes it all so clear. We're going to move quickly to Rosten, just in the interest of time. So with that, I turn it to you.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? Yes? All right, cool. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if you see it. Do you see my screen? Thumbs up. All right, cool. Okay. All right. Hi, my name is Rosten Wu. I am going to take this in a slightly different direction, but I promise it'll all arc back and make sense in the end. And I probably packed a few too many slides in here, so I'm going to use the ill-advised strategy of just talking fast and moving through it. So I'm going to talk about some different strategies, what I like to think of as adventures in the interpretive layer. The interpretive layer is, I think, a pretty common concept. Something that I think the first time I really heard someone use it was from Matthew Coolidge from Center for Land Use Interpretation. And I think the idea is pretty simple, that basically, what you see in a landscape is often very predetermined by what you expect to see, and all these things that happen in the space of interpretation before you actually get to that place. So I'm going to show 3 different kinds of things you can do in that layer, and the last one we'll talk kind of extensively about a few park interventions. So the first one is just, you can make it legible. And so to give a concrete example of this is a project called Vendor Power that I produced about, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago with an organization called the Center for Urban Pedagogy that I co-founded in New York City in collaboration with the Street Vendor Project, which is a membership-driven advocacy organization run by street vendors. So this example of what you might call sort of, I don't know, a lack of operational transparency. So everyone has equal access to law theoretically, but if you're a street vendor in New York, you can like try to figure out where you can or can't vend, and you're met with something like this. So it's like, food vendors shall be prohibited from vending on these streets following times a day. So if you can see the screen, even if you had a law degree and were a fluent English speaker and had a lot of time on your hands, you still would have a really hard time figuring out where you were or were not allowed to do what you need to do to make a living. So this project, really simple idea, is just to take that kind of legal language and work with lawyers and designers to produce something that translates it into a very simple diagram. You know, so this is sort of like the IKEA furniture diagram version of city policy. And the idea here is that you can make a document like this, and it's not just sort of helpful information in an abstract sense, but it's something that becomes an operational tool that will change the power dynamics in an interaction between a street vendor and someone in the police. You create operational transparency. So now people actually have greater access to law. They know where they can and can't be. And so if someone tells them they have to move, they can actually open this document and say, well, I don't think I do. I'm 20 feet from this doorway and I'm 10 feet from the sidewalk. And they have more security in their rights and in interaction. At the same time, the project opens up to kind of tell a larger story, not just about like what the laws are, but ways that the laws could be better, and sort of this larger framework of advocacy around street vending. So that's like one example of just a simple intervention you can make in that interpretive layer. Just making something legible. So just to finish that up, printed in edition of 10,000 and distributed for free to street vendors throughout New York City. And now is something that the city itself has picked up, and the Department of Consumer Affairs prints them themselves to distribute. And the idea is again, that making that information available can change actual interactions that you might have. Second thing is you can make something visible. And I'm going to give a very brief, probably too fast overview of this project. This is something I was asked to do by Los Angeles County Arts Department about maybe 7 years ago. And I was asked to produce a creative visioning tool, some sort of like planning tool for the neighborhood of Willowbrook, which is an unincorporated spot in LA County in between Watts and Compton. A lot of people have not heard of Willowbrook, but almost everybody in the world has heard of Watts and Compton. And when they hear of Watts and Compton, they have certain images that have been broadcast over and over and over again about what those places are. So you can give this presentation in Berlin or Brazil, and people say, oh yeah, Watts, Compton, I know, I get it. Of course, you can also give this presentation in, whatever, an LA County Planning Department, and people might say, oh, Watts and Compton, I get it. And they still have these same very specific and very wrong ideas of what that place is in their heads. So when I got to Willowbrook to do this project, it became really clear, abundantly clear, that people did not really want to do any more creative visioning, that they'd actually done a lot of creative visioning. So here's an excerpt from a plan for Watts from the 1970s. That starts like this. Let's be honest. The last thing the residents of Watts want to see or read about is another plan for this nationally known community. Plans and studies have a way of wearing thin over the years, and this brochure is the summary of still another plan. And you can continue to read along here, and there's no point at which it says, and this one will be different, or something different will come out of this planning process. It's already, 40 years ago, there's a sense of planning fatigue, that you could kind of do visioning exercises all day, every year for multiple years, and nothing actually would really change. And that sense was very alive and well in Willowbrook. And in fact, an international consulting firm had in fact done a visioning project for this exact neighborhood the prior year to when I was asked to do this. So of course, in that situation, it becomes incredibly depressing to imagine just sort of doing that same kind of project for no real meaningful outcome. Sort of what I think in the 70s and 80s might be what people might call, being a poverty pimp, someone who makes their living off of like consulting for poor communities without ever actually delivering anything of real value. And of course, that's like the most depressing way you could possibly think of yourself. So the dilemma became, how do you figure out what to do productively with this, with this opportunity, with this, money essentially from the county. And so after many months of sort of like talking to different people in the neighborhood, it became clear that maybe something that could be useful here would be something that would, instead of coming up with a vision of what this neighborhood could be or should be, just trying to figure out a way to describe what it is already might actually be really valuable. So again, it kind of like the straightest arrow to that, it became a home, garden, and vehicle tour. So it's both a physical 2-day event and also a publication. And it basically is just a way to show a different kind of story that hopefully kind of scatters and breaks up an image that you might have of what Willowbrook is and what it needs. And instead of, this is a common thing we hear in planning, instead of thinking of it as primarily a set of problems that a planner could come in and solve, how do you think of it as a set of really amazing or interesting, or at least just sort of hard to process instances in this community? So examples of this would be, all these backyards that people have. So these are a couple where the man in the couple had an exotic turtle collection and the woman had an exotic cactus collection. They got together and they kind of created a backyard paradise. Here's a fountain that was constructed by a self-taught stonemason from the rubble from the construction of the 105 freeway. This is a marching band that was led for many years by Barry White's arranger and travels nationally performing. This is a all-volunteer dog training school that's run by 2 retired truck drivers. This is a model railroad system that was built in the backyard of a retired nurse. These are all these different car clubs that exist in the neighborhood. The one on the right, his father was a mechanic for Herbie the Love Bug, and there's a massive collection of VW Beetles. This is a guy who runs a horse and buggy service, gives kids rides to prom and rides his horse and carriage around in the street. And so the idea is to kind of create images like this that might make something visible out of place that otherwise I think you can really overcode. And I would say, I go so far as to say that much of what we see when we walk around a neighborhood is built on assumptions that we have based on race and class and gender. And I think that trying to create alternate ways for people to interpret or see a neighborhood that is not their own can have really valuable results in terms of the kinds of interactions and projects that they dream up of after they have an interaction with that. So again, just talk about distribution. This is a publication that was produced in another edition of 10,000. Half of them were distributed in the neighborhood and sold as a fundraiser for the local library, and the other half is given away to planners and people who work for the county who are assigned to work in the neighborhood. And it's kind of an alternative guide, I guess, orientation material for people who are expected to do projects there. And so instead of seeing like, okay, here's a bunch of spa statistics about death rates, instead they go, well, here's some really interesting stuff that's going on. How can I get involved with this person? Could I get someone to do horse and carriage rides at our next event? The idea is that it can be kind of a directory in that way. So the last thing, and this is where I'll kind of get into the actual topic of parks, is some projects that try to make something, a space complicated. And in these projects, I kind of worked really directly with the straight down the line format of the interpretive sign. So I'm not going to talk at length about these ones because Julia already introduced them. But I produced some signs for the Bowtie parcel. And part of them was to try to create signs that sort of mixed natural history that you might expect in an interpretive signage with other kinds of didactics. So these was a diagram that was put into a sign that talks about both the hydrology of the area that makes the Glendale Narrows a really interesting place, but also talks about the ways that public investment can spur private investment. And just as a side note about producing work in public space, and maybe we'll get into this in the Q&A, but it's really important to me when you're thinking about making a work in a public space to think about accessibility. One of the things that's really wonderful about making work that is that you don't have to intend to see in order to see, that's why I kind of like working in the public sphere as opposed to a gallery or museum setting, is that your audience can be people who are not trying to see your work, who don't care about your work. But you have to make it accessible. So something that's really important is something at even just at the level of language. I saw that someone posted a comment even on this forum, oh, everything's in English, like this is not for me. And I think that in LA, language accessibility is a really fundamental way to think about how do you actually make a space truly welcoming. So there's a sign about real estate investment and the possibility of a park, some of the issues that that Julia brought up, and Jessica. And then this is a sign that sort of talks about this kind of dual dynamic, this complicated dynamic of camping on that site. Because on the one hand, Clock Shop and state parks were encouraging these campouts, and it's a really wonderful, really fun event. At the same time, there's increasing policing and clearance of people who are camping there not for leisure, but because this is where they need to sleep. So it tells these two parallel stories about camping, about sort of the history of camping in America and how it sort of became a thing after the Civil War, and about the kind of increased the history of policing of vagrancy in Los Angeles. It tells those stories side by side without really trying to resolve them or say like, and here's what you need to think, but hopefully kind of opens up again this kind of confusing space where I think you can actually kind of hopefully change your mind. So those signs led to some other signage projects. One really trying to tread lightly upon that site, and it's an audio tour that starts out seemingly about just sort of a native plant guide, but then sort of becomes stranger and stranger as you go, and talks more about sort of ideology of native plants and its origins in Nazi Germany, and the idea of what is invasive and what is native, and what needs to be preserved and what needs to be rooted out. And then these signs that talk about groundwater and sort of try to give kind of a history of sort of the environmental justice issues around groundwater pollution in the area. So those signs led to a really interesting opportunity from state parks to produce signage for Los Angeles State Historic Park. So I will just say that the leadership of Los Angeles State Historic Park, or Los Angeles State Parks, I think is really visionary, and they're really open to doing experimental things, which was really wonderful for me, where they actually wanted someone like me to produce interpretive signage for their park because it could fit into this sort of hard to pin down area where they wanted to tell stories that might not be the stories that you would have to tell in the official interpretive signage, but would still be really important or helpful orientation. And I think it's specifically the story that they were interested in highlighting was the story of community organizing that led to the creation of Los Angeles State Historic Park. So if you don't know that park, it's in Chinatown in downtown Los Angeles. It's one of like the largest, by sort of like uninterrupted acreage, like parcels that have been kind of acquired by parks in recent years. And it was like a more than 20-year struggle to get that park built. And it was kind of like an amazing story where it was initially slated to become a warehouse project by a very wealthy developer. Organizers who are interested in a variety of things, both environmental justice, civil rights, ecological issues, came together to create the Chinatown Yards Alliance and said, no, you shouldn't, this shouldn't just be given away to this developer. This rail yard should become something else. And eventually it became this park, which is an incredible resource. And so it is like kind of an amazing victory story. So the theme hopefully is like abundantly clear here. It's sort of like this sort of possibly official signage, but at this askew angle that sort of also makes it, you feel like it's kind of on the level of informal signage or protest signage. And tells the story of this park. And again, one of the things that's really wonderful about making things in public is that a bunch of people who are not expecting to see it have to interact with it. So it says the same thing in Chinese. And then it also has an audio story that tries to tell that story in more detail. And one of the things that I sort of felt was important to talk about in talking about this park is both that it's like kind of a wonderful victory, but it's also kind of this very bittersweet victory in a lot of ways, right? So on the one hand, it's a huge environmental justice win for that community and those people who fought for the park. But as sort of Julia was mentioning, all the people who were kids who wanted to have that park, by the time that park was built, they're in their 30s and they probably don't even live in that neighborhood. And what's more, here's sort of the park that came to be, which is essentially like a really, really large open field. And then here's the park that was that the community fought for. It had really different things in it, right? So it had soccer fields, it had tennis courts, it had a middle school, it had like a Shaolin temple, all these things that you don't see at the park now. And so I wanted to sort of both show like this is a wonderful thing, but it's also these stories don't unfold in like a open and shut way that you say, we want a park and a park gets made and then you can kind of check out and the right thing is going to happen. There's so much more that's going to unfold from there. So the park itself, and, and I think the other thing that is sort of alluded to by Julia and Jessica is that when you do these kinds of improvements to a public space, you also are kind of driving these other kinds of investments. So when you look at across the street from Park now, you're starting to see the development of, luxury towers and fancy beer gardens and a variety of things that are very different environment than the incredibly park poor Chinatown neighborhood that fought for this park when it was an abandoned rail yard. So this kind of the way that the timing works can lead to some really bittersweet outcomes. So over time, I've added more to this. So there's now 10 other signs that sort of tell the story in different details. Trying to take sort of like minor aspects that you might ignore in the space, like all the purple boxes, and build those as sort of hooks for people to kind of learn more about like what's involved in actually maintaining a park. How does like recycled water actually work? Is it safe and why? And then I think the thing that I sort of mentioned a few times that I think is really important is sort of to try to sort of, I guess, highlight the not givenness of a space, where a lot of times you encounter a park and you imagine that it's always been there, and that it's always, this place has always been the way it is, kind of from the beginning of time. And so, but in that particular site, it is a historic park, and there's just so many histories of displacement that kind of converge at that one spot. From Yang Na to the Chinese massacre to Chavez Ravine, all those sorts of stories. And so if you call this number when you're at this particular sign, most of what you hear is just someone describing what they see at the park when the sign was put in, which I think was in 2016, with the idea that over time, like in 2040, that will seem like a really strange, very different landscape than what you're actually able to see at that site now. So in a way, the kind of the sign is meant to sort of serve as its own time capsule and be kind of obsolete in an interesting way over time. So I think I'll end there. But those are sort of some of the ways that I've tried to work in this interpretive layer to make a space harder to take as given.
Thanks, Rosten. Okay, so we'll move right to Marcos. I think we're just hitting the hour mark, and Marcos will tell us a little bit more of the work he's doing in Debs Park.
All right, can y'all hear me? Good. Yeah, I'm gonna go into share mode. So, yeah, hello everyone. Like, how awesome has this been? I've learned so much already, and it's really exciting to have these conversations. And when I look at just what we're talking about and discussing, how we're able to really, I guess, set the stage for these discussions in a meaningful way. And one thing that I just have to acknowledge, coming from a national organization that is predominantly middle to upper class white demographic, in the moment that we are, where we're confronting white supremacy and institutionalized racism and talking about access to open space, inclusion, all of these things that go into what we're really focusing on is, I think it's a great moment in time. It's also very difficult to have a lot of these conversations, especially when you have a group of people that have been doing the work for so long. And now it gets to a point where I kind of joke about it, but it's not really a laughing matter, but where it's just like, you know what, maybe something might happen now that white folks are starting to jump on it and really be uncomfortable with what is actually happening in the state of our country. So with that, I just want to start with, so Marcus Trinidad, I'm the center director for the Audubon Center at Debs Park, and a couple of things just about being in this space. We're in Highland Park. I'm from Highland Park, born and raised, where my family's actually been for over 70 years. A really interesting fun fact, or I guess interesting to myself and and fun for my family, is that my parents actually met 1 block from Debs Park at the bus stop. And my grandmother still lives half a block from Debs Park. So the joke in the family is often that I was destined to be the center director of Debs Park, which I'm really excited to do. And this is an area of Debs Park. You can see Debs Park in the center, but there is a huge space that is 282 acres in Northeast Los Angeles. It's the 4th largest park. If you look in the distance up at the top of the screen, that's Elysian Park. So Elysian Park is bigger than Debs Park, but you see that there is a significant amount of tree canopy and there is park space. This is generally not the narrative that folks have when they think of Los Angeles. This is what I grew up with. So when I often travel or when I do speaking engagements, it's a very different conversation because I talk about the birds in the neighborhood, the coyotes that are running down the street, and folks are like, what? You live in Los Angeles, there's no nature. So one of the things that we do at a nature center is really look at that connection that we have to build or reconnect people to the space, and understanding that this experience is very different. The Audubon Center was the first center that was built in an urban area that had the primary focus of serving the Latino community. So the intention was there just about 20 years ago, and just all the work, the time that it had taken to really build up to that. These are some of the things that we really focus on in really delivering our program, and how we look at conservation and community and social needs and really find that balance. And we take a holistic approach in really being able to address conservation issues with this wraparound method, where we're able to partner with organizations that historically have not been partners for conservation organizations. And just to get into the projects and everything we have, it would take a much longer time. So for this point, I'm really going to focus on a couple of questions that we have with what we're working at in Debs Park. And I'm so glad that there was so much shared on the LA River, because we also focus on meeting the community where they are. And we realized that the LA River was a place where a lot of us grew up going to and want to continue to experience. And there's a lot going on as we all seen. So now we're looking at going through a very difficult time. And what has this really taught us about our spaces and what our infrastructure is as having open space or public parks, and who is available, or where is this accessible to? We had a conversation a little earlier where like birding is the hip thing to do now. Like go out and bird watch while you go on your walk or your hike, take a pair of binoculars. And then we also joked where, hey, you know what? It might not be accessible to everyone, as we were able to see an incident out in Central Park with a friend of mine, Christian Cooper, that was not very friendly. So those are the things that Debs Park really looks at in being able to offer programs that are accessible to everyone. And how do we really open up this space? And one way that we do that is by valuing all use of outdoor space. And usually when you have a nature center that is built in a particular way, it's almost with this idea of if you build it, they will come. And for us, a lot of times when folks come out to the center, we have to be able to see the value in all of their activities, because it's not just about going out and bird watching. It's not just about conquering the mountain or kayaking down the river. It's about having an experience that is meaningful. And that was one thing that we really had to look at as an organization, and understanding that we need the community more than the community needs us. Another question that we really wanted to be able to talk about is how do you strike that balance between public access and creating spaces for unhoused neighbors? And this is a huge issue, specifically along the LA River, but also closer to us in a 282-acre park. There's a lot of camps out there. And for us, it is really about being able to see the cause of homelessness as the threat, not the people. When we look at camps, we look at camps as a conservation threat. If we're investing resources in building habitat, in creating art installations and public programming, all of these things that are valuable, and we have individuals, people that are living in the park and are starting fires to eat or to stay warm, and it accidentally gets out of control and destroys habitat, that is a conservation threat. So one thing we had to look at as a conservation organization that's focused on birds and bird habitat is, how do you effectively advocate for affordable housing? How do you advocate for mental health resources, domestic violence, substance abuse, human trafficking, all of the issues that are normally not really discussed by conservationists? It's usually like, well, let the social worker handle those issues. We fully embraced, in the sense that those are priorities in the community, and those need to be addressed before we can effectively bring any of our priorities as a conservation organization to the table. So one thing that we had done, which was hot off the press, we released last week, was we created an anti-displacement toolkit on green infrastructure. And this is specifically for the LA River. These are a set of guidelines that are meant to be used by the city and conservancies and nonprofits like my own, to make sure that we are protecting the communities that are affected by planting trees and bicycle lanes and art installations. Unfortunately, a lot of these activities are looked at as improvements that may not be suitable for every community member. So it's really important to be able to include the community a part of these discussions. So you could go down to greeninginplace.org and download the toolkit. We partnered with SICA, Southeast Asian Community Alliance, and Public Council, as well as Team Friday, to really put this together, and we are grateful to those partners. Another question is art in public space. Now, when we look at art in our space, we look at cultural relevancy. Is this art that our community can connect with? Is this art that our community members see themselves in, that is able to help with that reconnection of culture, land, and community? So one thing we were able to do is really be able to invite the Gabrielino Tongva people back into a space. This is Tongva land, and come up with a strategy where we're able to continue this conversation and advisory on how to best provide programming and take care of the land. And it has been extremely just rewarding to see what can grow when it's an inclusive process. So a lot of that is dealing with intention, and being able to listen to the community in a meaningful way, and not have the answers, and not have the already boxed up package that we want to see. It's really figuring out all that stuff together. So we're a bit more focused on the projects. So that's a little bit from what we're doing at Audubon. Again, I'm really excited to continue the conversation and hear some of the questions. These are ways that you can get in contact with us. And again, I'm really excited that we're having this conversation, and I really appreciate Mocha in hosting a conversation like this.
Thanks, Marcos. So we're at it's 5:14 now, and I just want to ask one sort of like discussion or question for the panel, because as I've been hearing these presentations, there seems to be like kind of inherent tension, right? Like not between us, thank God, but between some of the situations, that Julia brought up in terms of development, in terms of need and inclusion. And I want to bring the conversation around back to art in some way and say, how do you make sure that the projects that you put in these spaces, whether it be like a project like Rosten or Clock Shop or a park, doesn't become just an added value proposition for developers or someone like that who might be barring inclusion? How do you make sure that the projects that you're working on are actually servicing the community members that you're targeting? Might be too strong a word, but that you ideally want to involve in this process? Any of you can take that.
I can jump on there. I just noticed that I was still off of mute, so I might as well take advantage of that. We don't really start a project unless we know that the community wants the project. And for us, we as staff are part of the community. Everyone that we have at staff currently lives within 5 miles of the center. We eat, sleep, play, and work in our neighborhood. So a lot of what we look at is really being able to include voices that have not historically been heard in development of these projects. And when we look at conservation, we are looking at conservation as the platform to really do this community organizing and restoration. We talk about restoring habitat, but the focus really is about restoring the connection to people back to the land. And with that intention, I feel that we naturally stay focused on who the project's for and how it's going to impact the community. And then we just run guard on any interference, or anytime anyone is trying to lean it one way or another. And what we do is ask for help. We are okay with not having all the answers, and we love to partner. It's just so much more fun that way.
On the opposite, like on the other end of the spectrum from the large scale planning, something that we've spent a lot of time in the last few years on is affordable housing, both preservation and development of affordable housing. And I think, like Julia mentioned, making sure that the percentage of units that are being put into different developments are actually a meaningful percentage of affordable units is really critical to that. So we have spent, with the LA River Master Plan work, a very large percentage of the time actually working with like SICA and other housing organizations across the county, and working with the CEO's office at the county to try to get ahead of issues with displacement. So unfortunately, like after a park project is announced is a little late in the process. Like after everybody knows that it's happening, developers have already swooped in and made their speculation. So we've been working very hard with LA County on land acquisition funds that can try to get ahead of that, so that years before some of these projects along the river are actually put into place, government entities have already invested in land or buildings in that neighborhood that can be in perpetuity made affordable. And so there's some of that that is, you know, at the government level, and then there's also a level in terms of like community land trusts and other efforts. I don't know if anybody's following some of the county motions, particularly that SD1 is putting forth around community land trusts and land acquisition funding, but it's all very tied to the river initiatives, and it's great to see that happening. The realization that if we wait until, you know, the master plan is done and we wait until parks are starting to be built, it's too late, and that needs to really be happening now. And so again, I think, and then of course the other thing I'm really happy to hear about the toolkit that was Marcos just mentioned, because it's really a whole suite of things. It's rent vouchers, it's rent control, it's a whole series of things that will allow people to actually stay and live in the communities that they're in along the river, and all of those pieces are part of the puzzle. And it requires a lot of people working together at all different levels of community activism and government investment to make some of that a reality. And I think, you know, as the master plan comes out, I'm excited to see the goals around equity and inclusion and anti-displacement that are in there. And I think, you know, holding everyone accountable over the coming years to make that a reality is important.
Yeah, I think that I'm so happy about this greening in place work that you did, Marcos, with SICA. And, you know, we also work with SICA in the Casitas Coalition and the Elysian Coalition. And for me, just echoing that, working together in coalition is really the key to responding to a lot of this private development that's happening.
I think we just might have lost Julia for a little bit.
I can jump in, but is that rude? I don't know. She's like in the mid-sentence. Oh no, she's back.
I'm back. Okay. Okay. I don't know why that happened, but it says my internet connection is unstable. Is it okay? Am I there? Okay.
You're there
anyway,
now.
Okay. So just bringing the community in and informing people about how this whole planning process works, and understanding like this development that's going to be at the park. Most people in the neighborhood don't really know about it, and they don't understand how to intervene in this process. And, you know, the public comment period was started right at the beginning of COVID, and then they didn't extend it. And so we had to fight for that. So it's the key to me right now is working together in coalition, because in moments of crisis, capitalism and development dollars just roll on through, and it's not good for the people who are here. So you really have to be in coalition and resist. Rosten, I'll hand it to you.
Well, I mean, to the question, I mean, I agree with everything that has been said thus far about the overall development framework, but in terms of what can a arts presentation be doing to avoid just being window dressing for development? You know, I think I have some like kind of specific thoughts of like what MoCA could be doing. You know, I think, you know, that are going to be hard for MoCA to do, but I think would be really good for MoCA to do. You know, one of them is figuring out how to share power over what that programming looks like. So it's not just sort of presenting something, you know, just presenting something in public doesn't make it for the public. You know, you don't create an inclusive space just by saying, well, anyone is, you know, the doors are open, anyone can come in here. There's so many ways that a space can still be coded as very much not inclusive, as a totally white space that people might feel like they can't come to if they don't meet certain criteria, if they're not from a certain cultural background, yada, yada. I mean, and you kind of brought this point up in a very specific way, but you know, if you're not housed, like this event is not for you, this park is not really for you, you're a trespasser here. All these things can be implied without being explicit. So I think the way to like really ensure that that doesn't happen, or the best way you can ensure that that doesn't happen, is to actually share power over how those events are produced, who's invited, how they're structured, and figure out, well, how do we get, you know, the tribes involved in organizing this event with us? How do you treat unhoused people as real stakeholders in what this event should look like? and really thinking through all of those different sets of people that might not be the natural, obvious audience that you might ask at MoCA, but because you're now in a public park, you have all these different stakeholders that you can't just expect to just like show up and find you. It's like a ton of work to go and find them and bring them in and give them a reason to want to be part of it. And then to create to kind of co-program, so creating inclusive spaces is so much work. I mean, it's that it could be somebody's full-time job right there, is just how do you set the table to make it the conditions for a space to feel inclusive. And it's really beautiful. It's really beautiful, and you can really tell when a space is, but they never just happen. They're never just going to be like, oh, the park is open, we just got this amazing crowd. There's so much, real work that's happening.
Right. I think, we often think here at MoCA that, our plaza is public, right? Like you can walk through, and we try to make, our plaza at the Geffen, we have a lot of efforts underway right now to make it imbricated back into an urban fabric, right? To like rather be the barrier, but it's incredibly difficult, like it's really hard not to take it for granted that there is in fact an invisible barrier between the street and the institution that works on so many different levels, regardless of what's being shown inside the building, right? So it's something that we are really trying to think about, is how to, beyond even art, like beyond what we're showing in those spaces, to really think about access. But I'm gonna stop the sort of discussion part, because we have so many good questions that I don't think we're gonna get to, and I know some of you might have to jump off at 5:30, so I don't want to drag people on too long. But there was a really interesting question about along the same lines about access. How do you continue that community engagement work now during the pandemic? And do you have any recommendations for working with those who may not have digital access during these times?
I mean, one of the ways I'd say is just try to give people digital access. I do a lot of work with Los Angeles Poverty Department. And, one of the first things that they had to do is figure out ways to provide free Wi-Fi in Gladys Park so that the people who are part of their theater company could actually be part of any of the rehearsals. It's like, I think maybe, I think that's sort of like, it's really hard to do anything in person. So I think that the number one thing is, how do you actually provide free access to people? Whether that means giving people smartphones or distributing free Wi-Fi in more places.
We've been spending a lot of time on this, and since the shift in March, because our office has so many ongoing projects that are doing engagement. And I will say we've learned a lot in the last months, and what works well on digital and what doesn't. We've been trying to invest in some non-digital things, so like coloring activity books that can be printed for parents at home with their kids, that relate to some of the projects or relate to like educational things about the LA River, for example. And then starting to understand what are some of the things that people can do outside in parks. So maybe shifting more to like getting signage up that might talk about something, because people might be visiting their park more, and then they could read about things. So I think we're constantly learning about the non-digital. We've also spent a lot of time examining along the river which communities have lower internet access or barriers to some of that type of communication, and trying to get, we're doing a direct text messaging campaign when the Los Angeles River Master Plan posts in a couple of weeks to people that live adjacent to the river, things like that, to try to reach an audience that might not have like a computer or direct internet access. And again, it's an ongoing process. We're learning, we're trying to get better at it every day. It definitely has been a shift, I think, for a lot of folks.
We're working with LA State Historic Park to bring programming there, and really looking at the COVID guidelines, and doing some music programs where we have smaller groups of people who have been quarantining together or in a pod, and kind of rotate through the park. And they've been very open to experimenting with us. And the great thing about LA State Historic Park right now is that it's just, people are using that space more than ever from almost every neighborhood, and I do just want to call out one thing, that there's this project that everyone should be aware of the gondola project that is connecting LA State Historic Park to Dodger Stadium, which I think a lot of questions can be raised about that and where it's located. And it's right now in, the NOP was released, and you can learn about that on Metro. It will take up a big portion of the park. And I think that the public needs to know more about that and to find out about how public space is possibly going to be whittled away. So putting in a pitch there.
All right, everyone. I think this is a good place to end the discussion. I thank you all for joining us. Thank you, our panelists. This was amazing. And I think, you know, what I walked away from this panel is like, there's two things you should do: get informed and go outside, go to these parks, use these parks. This is something you can still do right now. You know, like this is, of course, things have changed in the pandemic, but your parks are there. And if you don't use them, bad things will happen. So thank you again. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your questions. And join us next month for another panel about public art and continued programming. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.